there was a gradual withdrawal from the Middle East by those earlier imperial powers, namely France and the United States. They let go of the Levant, which included Syria and Lebanon, and of Palestine, and essentially they were replaced by the United States, particularly after the Second World War. So the United States became the dominant military power in the region only after the Second World War, and it became a major focus for the US foreign policy.
Hello, everyone. A lot has already been said about the election of Donald Trump as president yesterday. Tonight, I note two particular things to be grateful for. First, we had an election that appears to have been free and safe. Second, I note this forum and the opportunity to pursue with you WorldBoston's mission of international engagement and global cooperation, and I'm grateful for that. As the next president, Donald Trump will face a massive challenge regarding the future relationship of the United States to the Middle East. The topic has helped define American foreign policy and our domestic discourse in this century. Whether this is your 100th WorldBoston event or your first, you know how difficult it can be to talk about the Middle East. And this difficulty often shuts down conversation. Yet, let this recent election remind us that it is our duty to be informed and engaged citizens, not just of our communities or of the United States, but of the whole world. So we talk about hard stuff. Good evening, I'm Mary Eintema, President and CEO of WorldBoston, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Great Decisions. Dr. Ali Banuazizi is Research Professor of Political Science at Boston College and Research Affiliate at the Center for International Studies at MIT. After receiving his PhD from Yale in 1968, he taught at Yale and the University of Southern California before joining the faculty of Boston College in 1971. Since then, he has held visiting appointments kind of everywhere: University of Tehran, Princeton, Harvard, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Oxford, and MIT. He served as the founding editor of the Journal of Iranian Studies. He is a past president of the Association for Iranian Studies and of the Middle East Studies Association in North America, and currently editor-in-chief of Freedom of Thought Journal. Dr. Banuazizi is the author of numerous articles on society, culture, and politics of Iran and the Middle East, co-author of the book Social Classes, the State and Revolution in Iran, and co-editor of 3 books on politics, religion, and society in Southwest and Central Asia. So, at long last, Dr. Banuazizi, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eintema and Mr. Zyberg, for inviting me to participate in your Great Decision series. I only wish that you had not scheduled the talk so close to the great decision that was made at the polls last night, given all the stress and anxieties that we have all experienced, I believe, over the past few days and weeks. The consequences of that historic decision for the Middle East is not the focus of my presentation, thankfully, but I will say a few words about it towards the end of my talk. I was asked by Dr. Eintema to discuss the Mideast realignment, which I took to mean the many ways in which the recent developments, conflicts, and wars in the Middle East have changed the region's geopolitics and its relationship with outside powers, including, of course, the United States. I should mention parenthetically that my focus will be on the Middle East rather than the broader category that includes Middle East and North Africa, Tunisia, and Morocco, and so on. This slide shows that broader category of the Middle East and North Africa, but I will be focusing primarily on the Middle East. So that was the Ottoman Empire, which included, as I mentioned, many parts of the Middle East. And then after the First World War, and as I mentioned before, by 1923, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, and Turkey, which was the core of the Ottoman Empire, became an independent country, of course, and then Syria and or French Syria and British Palestine essentially replaced the Ottoman Empire. So the colonial period then began in the early 1920s with the British and the French controlling much of the area of the Middle East, not Iran and Turkey, but many other parts of the Middle East that come under the rubric of the Arab world. So going back to this notion of what is meant by the word or by the phrase the Middle East, what are some associations that come to mind? Well, one equivalent almost for the Middle East, when we talk about it these days, is Islam. Many people view the Middle East as being almost synonymous with the Islamic world. The largest countries in the Muslim world are not in the Middle East. They include Indonesia, and pay attention to the sizes of those populations. Indonesia with a population of 284 million people, Pakistan, even India, which obviously is not an Islamic country, has a Muslim population of around, slightly over 200 million, and then there's Bangladesh and Nigeria and so on. So those are the countries much larger, much more populous than the Middle East. So the notion that the Middle East is more or less synonymous or equivalent to the world of Islam obviously is not tenable, is not correct. Now when we come to the Middle East, the major countries, of course, are Egypt, Iran, Turkey, Iraq, in that order, the largest, the most populous one being Egypt, followed by Iran and Turkey. And then we go down, there are roughly 17 countries that are included under this category of the Middle East. So other than this quasi-equivalency between the Middle East and the world of Islam, which, as I mentioned, is not correct. What else? Well, we think of the Middle East oftentimes primarily as the Arab world. Yes, it is true that most of the countries in the Middle East are Arab countries, but again, we should keep in mind that in the Middle East there are at least three major countries, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, that are not Arab countries. And in fact, they have a lot more in common, had they not been categorized under this rubric of the Middle East, with Central Asia, for example, with Afghanistan, and with the Caucasus. So they have been somehow rather artificially placed under this rubric of the Middle East, and rather than their connections to other parts of the world. So the other association we have with the word Middle East, of course, is oil. Yes, it is true that the world's greatest reservoirs of oil and natural gas are located in the Middle East as a region. But again, we should keep in mind that first of all, there are other parts of the world that contain such reservoirs, and that there are vast differences among Middle Eastern countries in terms of their oil wealth or their oil and energy resources. Okay, so let me get to the core of my talk, which is to focus on some of the major developments that have taken place primarily since the Second World War that have shaped what today we call the Middle East. What have been these major developments? Well, first of all, there was a gradual withdrawal from the Middle East by those earlier imperial powers, namely France and the United States. They let go of the Levant, which included Syria and Lebanon, and of Palestine, and essentially they were replaced by the United States, particularly after the Second World War. So the United States became the dominant military power in the region only after the Second World War, and it became a major focus for the US foreign policy. The objectives of the US during this period included, the primary three objectives included, one, preventing Soviet Union, that was the beginning of the Cold War, from gaining influence in that region. Protecting, the second goal or objective of the US was protecting oil resources, which were sold at a very low rate of something like $1 to $2 per barrel during that period. By that period, I mean the 1950s and 1960s, really until early 1970s, when there was a major shift or upscaling of oil prices. So that was the second objective. First one was protecting the region from Soviet influence, and the second one, ensuring that oil resources flow not only to the US, which was at that time an importer, today is an exporter of oil, and also to Europe and other Western allies. The third objective of the United States after the formation of the State of Israel was the protection and support for Israel. That was one of the primary goals of US in the region in those days. Okay? So that was one major development after the Second World War in the region, the replacement of the old imperial powers, their abandonment, and the move to, or United States move to replace them. Just to give you an example, the countries that we call, for example, United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Bahrain, these countries did not exist until 1971. At least they did not exist officially. Of course, they existed physically. And it was only when the British withdrew from the region that these countries began to be formed and became independent states. So that was one development. The other development in the region was and let me mention here, because it becomes relevant to some of the other points that I will be making, that during this period, in the 1950s and 1960s, the primary power in the region, if you will, the regional superpower that collaborated with the United States and essentially served as the policeman of the Persian Gulf, was the Iranian government, which was the closest ally of the US during that period. And in every way, the US supported Iran militarily and diplomatically and economically. So going beyond this particular change, what were some of the other events or developments in the region? Well, the rise of political Islam, which really began, of course, there was some politicization of Islam earlier on, back in the 1920s and 1930s in Egypt and elsewhere. But really the rise of what we today call political Islam began in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was not an extremist or quote-unquote terrorist movement, but it simply gave a powerful place to the Muslim groups in the politics of the region, increasingly so during this period from the late 1960s onwards. By the time we get to our own period, of course, the politicization of Islam becomes much more radical. We get to ISIS and so on and so forth. But those are relatively recent development. The main point is that Islam became politicized in the way that Christianity is becoming politicized, by the way, these days, during this period. And the sort of the supreme example of that, of course, was the Iranian Revolution of 1979. That was the first time in history since the time of the Islamic prophet Muhammad that a state was established that claimed divine provenance. That is, the politicization of Islam reached this highest goal of actually establishing a state, a fairly powerful state. At the time, it was the fifth powerful military in the world, the Iranian government under the Shah, which now became a so-called the government of the jurists, claiming divine provenance and essentially seeing himself as God's representative on earth. Okay? Now, with political Islam, or with the Iranian Revolution back in 1979, Iran began to play a very different role from what it had played earlier on. That is, the pro-Western Iran now became very much anti-Western, with its foundational ideology being the export of the Islamic Revolution to every Muslim country, as well as establishing a number of proxy groups to fight against Israel, which was declared as the enemy of the Muslim peoples. Now, there's something paradoxical about this claim that Iran would become the leader in the Muslim world. First of all, to go back to what we call the Muslim world, bear in mind the incredible vastness of that population, much of which has absolutely nothing to do with Iran or the Arab world. And also, bear in mind that Iran, the Iranians are the followers primarily, 90% or so, of a branch, of a sect of Islam, Shiism, which includes only 15% of Muslims in the world, for a sect that is declared, for example, by Saudi Arabia as deviant, okay, to claim that it wants to become the leader, the promoter of the Islamic world was clearly an overstated claim. So the proxy groups that Iran began to form, to establish, included, these are well known these days, of course, primarily and first the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which became gradually over the years, starting in 1982, but continuing obviously until the present, as the major power in Lebanon, interfering with the well-established pluralistic Lebanese government. So that was one group which has continued and has received, this Hezbollah has received substantial economic, military aid, as well as training and all kinds of other support from the Iranian government, and is sort of at the forefront of Iran's, hostile stance towards Israel. The second group, again, well known, of course, is Hamas, part of the Palestinian ethnicity, if you will, and part of Palestine as a state, which began a bit later, but it has continued also. That was the second group that was formed by the Iranians. The third group was actually a number of groups in Iraq. These were the various radical Shiite groups in Iraq. And finally, Syria received substantial help and aid from Iran. Iran became the only supporter of the Assad regime in the entire region of the Middle East. So this was another development during this period. Now we come to October 7th of 2023, and the savage attack that was launched against Israel. As you well know, it has been referred to as the worst attack against the Jewish people after the Holocaust, as a result of which over 1,200 Israelis, innocent Israelis, not military, but innocent Israelis, were massacred, and over 200 were taken hostage, and various kinds of absolutely savage treatments during that period. And then there has been, since then, the response of Israel, in part, I would say quite legitimate, to defend itself against an enemy that had attacked it, but then continuing well beyond that to the destruction of this narrow area, sliver of land, Gaza, over the past year. The killing of innocent civilians, numbering in the tens of thousands, over 42,000 since then, destroying hospitals, schools, and so on. Something like 12,000 Gazan students could not go to school this year because they were killed during this period. 12,000 school children, and on and on. So this has been the response of the Israeli government. As I mentioned before, and as I believe, in part legitimate, in response to the attack of Hamas at that point, but then continuing with no consideration for the civilian lives and essentially turning Gaza into a rubble. Okay, let me then come to the end of my presentation by talking about something which is very difficult to talk about at this point in time, namely the potential consequences of the election of Mr. Trump as the new president of the United States. What are some of its implications? Well, first of all, where did Mr. Trump stand prior to the victory of his elections? Obviously, very much in support of Israel during this period, and recognizing Jerusalem, for example, as the capital of Israel, and recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, abandoning the long-standing US commitment to an independent Palestinian state, which was always stated but never really pursued by the previous pursued seriously by the previous administration. Essentially, that idea was abandoned under Mr. Trump. And then, on positive side, the creation of what was called the Abraham Accord, which was an attempt to make peace between Israel and normalize diplomatic relations between Israel and at least 4 countries in the region, including United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, with the hope that other countries would join this peace, and essentially achieving a measure of peace and reconciliation between Israel and these countries. Mr. Trump had very favorable attitude towards Saudi Arabia and essentially saved the Saudi prince from the condemnation that he was receiving after the murder of the Washington journalist Khashoggi. The first trip that Mr. Trump made as president was to Saudi Arabia, and he provided, diplomatic support to the Saudis at that time, and was able to sign a weapons sales agreement in excess of $100 billion. With Iran, Mr. Trump withdrew from an agreement that had been signed back in 2015, the so-called JCPOA, which essentially stopped Iran's pursuit of nuclear weaponization of its nuclear program. Now, what might he do in the coming years? Very, very briefly. Well, he may play the role, which he's very much proud of a deal maker, and try to bring about a reconciliation. That would be talking in very positive terms, or looking very positively at this potential. However, in that regard, his private communications and statements on a few occasions have been, finish what you started, addressing Mr. Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, and get it over with fast. In other words, it's entirely possible that he may allow Israel to achieve a total destruction of Gaza, and to some extent even of the Hezbollah areas in Lebanon before he comes to office in January. And then he would play the role of the peacemaker to persuade Israel and the Palestinians to arrive at a new arrangement with the possible creation of an independent Palestinian state. Of course, the definition of that state will be left entirely to Israel, how it gets defined. And these days, it's not quite clear what Israel's ambitions are. The West Bank, for example, which was not part of the terrorist attack, has been attacked. Over 200 people have been killed in the West Bank, and there are, ultra-Orthodox Israelis that consider the West Bank as part of Judea and Samaria. So that may be another area that the government of Netanyahu may push for before any kind of agreement. I think there is general agreement by most observers in the rest of the world, in Europe and elsewhere, that without the creation of an independent Palestinian state, it would be impossible to create, to maintain, and to enjoy peace in the region. Saudi Arabia and all the other Gulf states have made it very clear that they will not join the likes of an Abraham Accord unless there is a two-state agreement. And one's hope is that Mr. Trump would, in his claims of being a peacemaker, pursue that goal and allow the formation of an independent Palestinian state alongside of Israel in peace. That is the hope and what would be a positive outcome of these developments. With many thanks, and sorry if I went a bit over my time.
Thank you very much. We have a million questions. So that being said, I'm going to take the first one. Sorry, but I think this may be on some of our minds when we talk about, I hope it will be, when we talk about realignment. To put it very, very crudely, in the Iran-Saudi rivalry, who's winning right now?
Well, I'm glad you used the word realignment. I was supposed to talk about it a bit more.
There's a lot to cover.
Yes. Very briefly, the Middle East has changed dramatically in terms of these realignments. Now we have Russia and China as major players in the Middle East. Russia and Iran have formed very close relationship, for example, and China is involved both economically, diplomatically, and politically, and in various security realms as well. So the realignment includes all of that, and the era of the United States being the dominant sole power in the region has ended. Mm-hmm. That is not going to continue without any question whatsoever. Mm-hmm. To come to your specific question, one of the interesting changes is that the two arch enemies, namely Iran and Saudi Arabia, have actually come to some kind of reconciliation with each other. And guess who made that possible? China. China was the country that brought these two powers together, and they now have relatively, not a love affair by any means, but they have normal relationships. So a lot is happening in these realignments in the region. Most important, the entry of Russia and China into the region, economically, militarily, security-wise, and diplomatically.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody, for letting me get away with that. I hope some of you had the same question. So raise your hands up high. Okay, the WorldBoston Brain Trust right here. We'll start with either Ed or Mary. And if you're a student or a first-timer, please do raise your hand.
Thank you very much for your talk today. I have a question about Syria. It looks like Assad won. He's still there, and I wouldn't have bet on it, but anyways. So what do you see next for Syria?
Do you want to quickly add on to that, Mary?
Yeah, basically, how are you going to get a two-state solution if Netanyahu has no interest whatsoever in it?
Okay, thank you.
one of the developments that took place in the Middle East, which in many ways unrelated to the issues that we've been talking about, but it was a quest for an end to the highly autocratic regimes in the region. As you know, that was called the so-called Arab Spring. And the manner in which it was dealt with and put down by Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, was truly, I don't know what words to use, over 500,000 people have been killed in Syria, and millions have become refugees. Syria, in fact, was, in a sense, not only condemned, but ejected from the Arab world. But in the past few months, there have been attempts to bring Syria back and perhaps to moderate its policies. I don't know what is going to happen to Syria. Iran, as I mentioned before, was the only supporter of Syria during those repressive acts by Bashar al-Assad. So the future.
Russia was too.
Okay.
Pardon me?
Russia too.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions in the back? Go ahead and ask your question.
Dr. Banuazizi, thank you so much. I will appreciate if you show the map of Ottoman Empire. My question is related to complexity of the complexity of the situation in the Middle East. For instance, as we see in this map, there was Palestine. There wasn't anything else. And your talk, basically, you stated October last year event, Hamas attack to Israel, and then while the conflict has been going on for 76 years, and I wanted to know your opinion on complex situation.
Okay.
All the actors in the region who may play a part in the day after, if you will, and that includes, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and various other countries in the region. I believe they have made it clear that without the creation of a legitimate, recognized Palestinian entity, they are not going to normalize their relationship with Israel, or let's say to join the Abraham Accord, which no longer really exists. The relationships are maintained, but there is not much substance to it. So I think that's a given, and it would be impossible to achieve any kind of reconciliation between Israel and its neighbors without the establishment, without the willingness on the part of Israel to recognize an independent Palestinian state. At least one sentence in response to the other gentleman who had the question. You are right that one cannot begin the narrative only with the October 7th attack of 2023. There's obviously a background to it and quite legitimate demands on the part of the Palestinians. So I would not, by any stretch of imagination, ignore that there were legitimate complaints and demands that the Palestinians had. What I did condemn was the manner in which, in October 7th of 2023, those demands were made into an attack against civilians and so on. That's the distinction that I would draw.
Thank you very much. So we had a question over here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm a Fulbright scholar at MIT. I just want to ask, what happens if the two-state solution doesn't happen? Do you think that this is actually, I mean, we heard about it. I'm from Egypt, and You know, we've been hearing about the two-state solution for many, many years. And I just want to, you know, ask you what will happen. I don't think anything will happen, to be honest. I think status quo would just prevail. And it really depends on the administration, the current administration, and their priorities. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
No, I am worried as much as you seem to be about that prospect. And let's not forget that this has been the American slogan, the two-state solution, for decades now. But, you know, we have not been able to push Israel. We have failed in the past few months in preventing Israel from pursuing the war in the manner that it has chosen to pursue it. You know, that's very clear. So yes, I'm not so naive to think that that's a given. I said that's the condition, the only condition under which there could be in the prospects of a more peaceful region. Otherwise, Hamas will reform, you know, Hezbollah would reform, and the conflicts would continue. And then let me add that Israel is going to suffer in terms of its reputation and standing in the world. That is obviously a worry that, let me also say that when we talk about Israel, we have to keep in mind that Israel is not one unit, that Israel is a divided society, that what I just said would be supported by, I believe, 50% of the Israeli people themselves, okay? So take that into consideration as well.
Good, thank you. Okay, somebody way in back, the hand up in the white sweater, I think.
Thank you. Israel is a divided society, but it's also a democracy. That's the difference also. My question was, who's the peace partner in the Palestinian side? Clearly not the terrorists or Al-Fatah, Abu Mazen, which they don't condemn the terrorist attacks on October 7th. So who's the peace partner on the Palestinian side?
So the negotiating partner.
Correct.
Yeah.
No, that's a very fair and an important question. I understand it will not be Hamas. Realistically, the only entity that we have today that could represent the Palestinian side is the temporary Palestinian government in the West Bank. Now that group needs to be reformed. There's no question about it. It has to be made more legitimate in terms of representing its own people, the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza. So those are the changes that need to take place. And I believe that an attempt to create a reconciliation would include the pressures by those who are going to make contributions to the creation of a new state, economic contributions and financial contributions and so on, to reform the Palestinian government right now in the West Bank. But I agree, the present Palestinian Authority does not have the wherewithal to negotiate and to establish itself as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But with certain reforms, I believe that's the only road forward. There is no other group that can represent the Palestinians in such an attempt.
Coming back to Iran, what do you see as the possibility of escalation, a military escalation between Iran and Israel in the next few months? And to what extent do you think the election of Trump changes those dynamics?
As you know, Iran has been declaring that it's about to launch a counterattack in this tit-for-tat with Israel. If it does so, I think it will receive a powerful response from Israel. And I think the conditions at this point in time are ripe for that kind of response to come from the Israeli side. On the other hand, with Mr. Trump, the great deal maker, that's his own, statement, his own words, he may serve notice on Iran that you need to do such and such, and you need to prevent any kind of hostile attack on Israel from your own territory, and you need to withdraw support from some of the proxy groups that you have in the region, or else. It is possible at this time that Iran may respond to that in a fairly, let's say, accommodating way. And the reason for that is Iran is currently in serious economic crisis and under great deal of pressure. To give you one quick example of that, the value of the Iranian currency, which used to be $1 for 70 tomans, it is now $1 for 70,000 tomans. So it's a 10,000 time decline in the value of the currency. But that's just one indicator. There are many, many other indicators. For example, Mr. Trump may issue a warning to China that stop buying oil from Iran, violating the terms of the sanctions. Do not buy oil from Iran. Right now, China is the only country in the world that is purchasing Iranian oil to the tune of something like $36 billion in the past couple of years. So that may drop out and or dry out, if you will. So being under those kinds of pressures, an ultimatum to Iran may have a conciliatory response. But obviously, I'm in no position to say that with any confidence.
You started to talk about Iran, and if I understand, you described the phenomena of a minority of a major religion essentially morphing into a state. And my question is, why Iran? And say, why Iran as opposed to one of the other countries in the region? The conditions are such that made that possible.
That goes back to the attempt to politicize Islam in Iran and the charismatic leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was able to mobilize a relatively westernized, highly educated population to follow him in this Islamic quest of establishing an Islamic government. That was an extraordinary event in Iranian history. People had not expected that. Those who participated in that revolution were not at all certain that that would be the outcome. The objective was to overthrow a government that they considered to be tyrannical and undemocratic and so on. But then, through a number of manipulations and, as I mentioned, the charismatic leadership of Khomeini, things began to change and the Islamic government was established, and it has endured, repressively endured, particularly in the past couple of decades, for the past 45 years since the Iranian Revolution.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Banuazizi.